Thank you, President Rees. One of the first things that President Rees did when he took on the presidency was a promise statement. And part of the promise statement is on campus, all are welcome. Christ is honored, but all are welcome. And he has made an attempt to make this campus a friendly place for everybody. So now I'd like to once again thank you for coming to join us and sharing these insights of the report. A little bit of a background. Many years ago, I had a friend, colleague here, and we wanted to develop relationships with universities in Mexico. So we took the train from St. Paul all the way down to Mexico City. We went to Zacatecas and Saltillo and San Luis Potosí, and I think people said I look like as if I am from Pátzcuaro in Michoacán. And then finally we landed in Monterrey, in ITESM, which we were so impressed as a university that is comparable or maybe even better than the U of M in terms of their business and other programs, and we had relationships with them. But one of the things that struck me when I visited with him, apart from the fact that he's a nice Norwegian and I look like I'm a Mexican, so when I would go to the restaurants, I would get the Spanish menu and he would get the English one, and it was the opposite. I speak little Spanglish and he was the fluent guy in Spanish. So it was, theirs was your stereotypes for you. But one of the things that struck us the most was how hospitable the people of Mexico were to the stranger, and how they would go out of their way to welcome us and connect us. And that really struck me. And the other part that struck me during these trips was there's a symbiotic relationship between Mexico and the US. Unlike any other country, they are a border country, and so the relationships are so strong and connected that way up in Saltillo, I would see a Texan roaming around the marketplace, and I talked to him and say, "What are you doing here?" "Well, I'm teaching people English." So when I came to Minnesota, when I came back, and I appreciated it, we were hit by this news about undocumented workers and how they are costing Minnesota a lot of money. And I found that we're not too hospitable to people like that. And so I began to do some research. And I found a database that had the firms that were sanctioned by the then Immigration and Naturalization Services. So I looked at that database and I found there were 1,000+ Minnesotan firms that use these workers all across Minnesota, including the state of Minnesota, including the University of Minnesota. And yet the popular mood was these people are costing us. And so I was talking to a reporter about that, and a little later she called me back and said, "Have you seen this report that's come out from the state?" And I said I didn't, but I'll look at it. And last time I called her back, and this report talked about how these people, the undocumented workers, were costing the state millions of dollars. And so my voice, and I want to say that the voice that comes out of Concordia University, the small liberal arts university by the freeway, that was the voice that was hit the wavelength in that evening saying, "But what about the benefits? And how can you capture that?" And so that got me, and the policy leader at that time, it ended up on National Public Lara News Hour, and the leader was quoted as saying, "Anybody who can't see the cost must be having their heads under the rock." And so since my head was already under the rock, I decided to look a little deeper, and that was the report funded by the Minneapolis Foundation that came out in 2008 and produced all this data on the economic contributions of people of Mexican origin. And I'd like to remind people that most of them are citizens of this country. And so that report then, in a smaller form, was produced by the William Mitchell Law School Review. And I tell you this because every fact, every reference, everything in that article was checked by these lawyers, because they wouldn't publish it in their journal, and there were about a team of 12 students or what. So that is almost like legal proof. Until today, I have not come across any document that challenges what I presented there about the economic contributions of this community. So it's 2015, and I said, I'm happy to hear that the governor had a trade mission to Mexico. So I said, it's time to review the study and see how can I update it, and that's what I'm going to present you today. But before I get there, I want to give you a vision of people that you see out here, and some of who are in this room, because this is a very vibrant face of Minnesota. People of Mexican origin. We have Council Member Alondro here, and in those days, she and our friend Mariano were doing a lot of work in rural Minnesota, and occasionally I get a call from Austin or somewhere, and they'll say, do you have this number, or can you come and speak? And I remember I've gone there a couple of times and enjoy the work that they do, but she is now the council member in the city of Minneapolis doing some outstanding work. Lately, I've heard from Mike Damali about creating a vibrancy in Lake Street around cultural corridors. Then we have, let me go from the top, the business concept, Louis Fitch and Uno, doing some good work in branding and marketing, and I engaged with them in 2000 when we did the Governor's Working Group in Minority Business Development, and since then, he's doing a lot of interesting work, but also to the fact that there's an increasing number of professional services companies in the community that's emerging, and a lot of them in Hennepin County. And everybody knows the La Loma, but also how a small business started locating in many parts of the metro area and doing very well. And then on the other side, you have this entrepreneur who, again, in partnership with MEDA and with Cargill and with others, Catalia Foods, and she makes I believe, one of the largest supplies of tortillas to McDonald's. So if you go and order anything in McDonald's, you're probably eating what she's done. But what I found interesting is her statement on corporate responsibility. And so this looks at the high quality of even the companies that we are having. There's somebody who's encouraging to make Minnesota a better place to live. Isabel Chancellor, I met her the other day, and when I took my son to the boxing studio, and I keep my distance from her because maybe sometime I might get a left hook, right? But Isabel is famous about the work that she did in the University Avenue with U7, the collaborative. When the freeway was coming through the metro, through this area, she was leading an effort of many community organizations, including Jean Jeljalu here, where we wanted to make sure that the entrepreneurs did not suffer, and she played a very important role. And so then we have Jennifer Goodiness. You hear a lot about her in the discussions about education and how we should have a high bar for everybody. Gilbert Delau, a veteran wounded in combat from this community in our midst, but also being a coach and being a big, building up the community. Hector, when you come across Hector, he brings you a larger vision of what Minnesota can be, a global state, connecting and tapping onto the energies and all the immigrant and minority communities, and that's the way he engages with a lot of institutions. And then my friend and Ramon Leon, who I worked for many years with, he is by trade a profession an upholsterer. So he represents a lot about the business entrepreneurs and the workers from the ground up, who now is making such tremendous amount of contribution to the state in entrepreneurship development, and as of today, I think is currently in Mexico City, and he's having a very interesting partnership at the local level. And then my friend Mariano here. These are people I know, I have a relationship with. There are so many other people out there, but I want to show you the wealth that is in our midst. But what struck me so much this legislative session was every day seeing him at the Capitol, and every day, and when there were hearings, those hearing rooms were packed. Now they talk about civic engagement. There was nothing to beat that kind of civic engagement I saw every day in the Capitol. Now, they didn't listen, but he was there. That's the other question. But he was there, and he's been doing that for a long time over the years. And again, he shows to the people around the DREAM Act and things like that how we can build up the state and make it work for everyone. So it's that vision that I want to show you of the people in our midst, people from of Mexican origin that are transforming Minnesota and making a big difference. And we've got to look at this community a little differently. So before I start, a couple of contexts, and this comes out right from the Minnesota Historical Society, the keeper of the history of Minnesota. And I read the book from there, and it says these are certain facts that Minnesota companies went out and recruited workers of Mexican origin and brought them here. Meatpacking, sugar beet, and other industries, and railroads. And when we brought them here, we didn't treat them well. In those early days, there's a record that they had the worst living conditions in the nation. And then we did not invest in them, and we did not invest in their children. And there were cycles of this, of them coming here, and we not taking care of them and pushing them out. And also evident in the fact there were a lot of Minnesotans who thought differently and reached out and supported this community over the years, and were their champions too. But overall, we never formally acknowledged that this community is important to Minnesota. And if the importance is so important, as I'll show you in some of the data, that if they were not here, Minnesota would not be the same and would not be as competitive. Some of the ways we have looked at this community, as documented in the book, as wetbacks, meaning they're coming in, undocumented people. We've referred to them as migrant workers to give the image that they are temporary and not permanent here. We've looked at them as, in some cases, invisible, because we didn't want to get a negative reaction to some of the efforts that were going on. And so the 2008 report offered a different vision of the community as assets, important economic assets to the state. And the question is, 2015, has anything changed? So the second context to look at it is there are two trends happening in it, and I call it the demographic squeeze. On one side, you have the increasing number of people who are dependent on the worker, either young or old. And on the other side are the number of workers. And you can see there's a gap between those two lines, and that's Minnesota's big challenge. How do we fit that gap when we have a demographic squeeze? And this community grew by 20% in that age group during the time period 2007 to 2013, the latest data that's available. So they're going to play, and they are going to play an important role in the future of Minnesota. And so I offer this concept of looking at the community as ethnic capital, as contributors in different communities, different areas, from entrepreneurs to consumers to workers to cultural assets, as Councilmember Landro is doing in Lake Street. President Reese was telling me a banker told him when he came to here that if the immigrants went on University Avenue, this place would be like Detroit, all boarded up. So people have been the entrepreneurs and taxpayers. And so I'm documenting some of those contributions in that area, taking 80,000 workers in the system at different levels and critical industries, 239 million in taxes. And how do I get that number? If I take the total income of 2.5 billion in income, and the state of Minnesota says that on average, a typical Minnesota pays 11.5% of that income in taxes, state and local taxes. So that's how I got that number. So the latest statistic just come out 3 days ago. 5,000 firms, 1.3 billion in sales, employing 5,000 plus, and a payroll of 158 million. The context of that number, all firms, that means the number of firms growing in Minnesota between the last time the census was taken, 2007 and 2012, it declined by 2%. Can you see that number? I can't read it, my eyes are bad, right? 62%. And look at the sales, it also grew by 89%. So you have an entrepreneurship base that is very vibrant that's going in Minnesota. Home ownership, the real estate value of $2.2 billion, and monthly putting about $20 million in rental payments to the economy. And the last time that the 2014 statistics or exports, Minnesota companies exported to Mexico $2.2 billion. That means we've become $2.2 billion wealthier with trade to Mexico. So you look at the local and the global in seeing that statistic. So that's what I thought I could document the growth. But then when I was looking at the comparison, some things shocked me when I saw the period over time. And this was the period that we're going through the economic recession, we're going through the housing crisis, and what I'm seeing is this great productive assets declining in value. Now remember, if you're a business owner and if you are someone who thinks about investments and assets, whether it's a company, if your assets are not growing and they're depreciating but also depleting, your long-term profitability is going to suffer. And for a state, if key human capital and key economic capacity of a community is taking a beating, the state's long-term profitability and competitiveness is going to suffer. So hit and home ownership rates gone down by 7.5%. And then the real rental cost, that means rent adjusted for inflation, is up by 3%. While their incomes, the real income, that means income adjusted for inflation, down by 6%. And as a result, this decline of income has put 158 million at least impact on the economy, a slowdown on the larger economy. And the other fact that might be tied to also these historical circumstances that I mentioned is that there are hardly 7 to 10% of people from the community who have a BA degree, and a lot of people in the below the BA degree. So that rate has not grown during this time period. And so that's a long-term future. Among the other statistics are about a third without health insurance. And the asset that you have here is, and it's a big policy importance, is that most of the young people from 3 and up to the high school are in that middle school area from grade up to the 8th grade. And that becomes a tremendous policy priority. If we want to do something not tomorrow, now, I'd say that middle school and the high school and then the college, it needs some. But these are some indicators of the stress on the economic assets. So we need time to grow these assets because, as I said, it's an economic imperative for us to do it. And there's information to show that when I did a simulation in 2008 and said, okay, what kind of impact does 80,000 workers have on the Minnesota economy? It's about a 6.5 billion. So these workers help create about 6.5 billion in earnings in the rest of the economy. And if they were to decrease their consumption by 500 million, it would cost about 5,000 jobs will be lost. And if we just take 2,500 workers from the meatpacking industry and they suddenly were not there, Minnesota would be hit by 400 million drop in earnings and about 17,000 jobs. So they are playing a very critical and integral part of the economy, and that's why we have got to look at their contributions and their assets and how we should also grow these assets for the future. And I think that's the policy challenge that we have today. So that, in essence, is my overview of the result.